Chapter 26 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 3. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jill Ingle. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 3, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 26. Premier or President? At noon on the 29th of March, the Cabinet assembled and once more took up the absorbing question of Sumter. All the elements of the problem were now before them. Anderson's condition and the prospects of relief, as newly reported by Fox. The state of public opinion in Charleston as described by Hurlbut. The Attorney General's presentation of the legal aspects of an attempt at collecting the customs on shipboard. The Secretary of the Treasury's statement of the condition and resources of the Revenue Service. The report of the Secretary of the Navy as to what ships of war he could supply to blockade the port of Charleston. And finally, the unexpected attitude of General Scott in advising the evacuation of Fort Pickens. All these features called out so much and such varied discussion that at length the Attorney General, taking up a pen, rapidly wrote on a slip of paper a short summing up of his own conclusions. This he read aloud to the President, who thereupon asked the other members of the Cabinet to do the same. They all complied, and we have therefore the exact record of the matured opinions of the Cabinet members then present. The importance of the occasion renders these memoranda of enduring interest. Mr. Seward wrote, First, the dispatch of an expedition to supply or reinforce Sumter would provoke an attack, and so involve a war at that point. The fact of preparation for such an expedition would inevitably transpire, and would therefore precipitate the war and probably defeat the object. I do not think it wise to provoke a civil war beginning at Charleston and in rescue of an untenable position. Therefore I advise against the expedition in every view. Second, I would call in Captain M.C. Meigs forthwith. Aided by his counsel, I would at once and at every cost prepare for a war at Pensacola and Texas, to be taken, however, only as a consequence of maintaining the possessions and authority of the United States. Third, I would instruct Major Anderson to retire from Sumter forthwith. Mr. Chase wrote, If war is to be the consequence of an attempt to provision Fort Sumter, war will just as certainly result from the attempt to maintain possession of Fort Pickens. I am clearly in favor of maintaining Fort Pickens, and just as clearly in favor of provisioning Fort Sumter. If that attempt be resisted by military force, Fort Sumter should, in my judgment, be reinforced. If war is to be the result, I perceive no reason why it may not be best begun in consequence of military resistance to the efforts of the administration to sustain troops of the Union, stationed under the authority of the government, in a fort of the Union, in the ordinary course of service. Mr. Wells wrote, I concur in the proposition to send an armed force off Charleston, with supplies of provisions and reinforcements for the garrison at Fort Sumter, and of communicating at the proper time the intentions of the government to provision the fort peaceably, if unmolested. There is little probability that this will be permitted, if the opposing forces can prevent it. An attempt to force in provisions without reinforcing the garrison at the same time might not be advisable. But armed resistance to a peaceable attempt to send provisions to one of our own forts will justify the government in using all the power at its command to reinforce the garrison and furnish the necessary supplies. Fort Pickens and other places retained should be strengthened by additional troops and, if possible, made impregnable. The naval force in the Gulf and on the southern coast should be increased. Accounts are published that vessels having on board marketable products for the crews of the squadron at Pensacola are seized. The inhabitants, we know, are prohibited from furnishing the ships with provisions or water. And the time has arrived when it is the duty of the government to assert and maintain its authority. Mr. Smith wrote, Viewing the question whether Fort Sumter shall be evacuated as a political one, I remark that the effect of its evacuation upon the public mind will depend upon the concurrent and subsequent action of the government. If it shall be understood that by its evacuation we intend to acknowledge our inability to reinforce the laws, and our intention to allow treason and rebellion to run their course, the measure will be extremely disastrous, and the administration will become very unpopular. If, however, the country can be made to understand that the fort is abandoned from necessity, and at the same time Fort Pickens and other forts in our possession shall be defended, and the power of the government vindicated, the measure will be popular, and the country will sustain the administration. Believing that Fort Sumter cannot be successfully defended, I regard its evacuation as a necessity, and I advise that Major Anderson's command shall be unconditionally withdrawn. At the same time, I would adopt the most vigorous measures for the defense of the other forts, and if we have the power, I would blockade the southern ports and enforce the collection of the revenue with all the power of the government. Mr. Blair wrote, "First, as regards General Scott, I have no confidence in his judgment on the questions of the day. His political views control his judgment, and his course, as remarked on by the President, shows that, whilst no one will question his patriotism, the results are the same as if he was in fact traitorous. Second, it is acknowledged to be possible to relieve Fort Sumter. It ought to be relieved without reference to Pickens or any other possession. South Carolina is the head and front of this rebellion, and when that state is safely delivered from the authority of the United States, it will strike a blow against our authority from which it will take us years of bloody strife to recover. Third, for my own part, I am unwilling to share in the responsibility of such a policy." Mr. Bates wrote, "It is my decided opinion that Fort Pickens and Key West ought to be reinforced and supplied, so as to look down opposition at all hazards, and this whether Fort Sumter be or be not evacuated. It is also my opinion that there ought to be a naval force kept upon the southern coast, sufficient to command it, and, if need be, actually close any port that practically ought to be closed, whatever other station is left unoccupied. It is also my opinion that there ought to be immediately established a line of light, fast-running vessels to pass as rapidly as possible between New York or Norfolk at the north and Key West or other point in the Gulf at the south. As to Fort Sumter, I think the time is come either to evacuate or relieve it." The majority opinion of the Cabinet on the 15th of March had been against the expediency of an attempt to provision Fort Sumter, but now, after a lapse of 2 weeks, the feeling was changed in favor of the proposed measure. Irrespective of this fresh advice, however, the President's opinion was already made up. On the day previous, he had instructed Captain Fox to prepare him a short order for the ships, men, and supplies he would need for his expedition, and that officer complied with characteristic and promising brevity. Steamers Pocahontas at Norfolk, Pawnee at Washington, Harriet Lane at New York, to be under sailing orders for sea with stores, etc. for 1 month. 300 men to be kept ready for departure from on board the receiving ships at New York. 200 men to be ready to leave Governor's Island in New York. Supplies for 12 months for 100 men to be put in portable shape, ready for instant shipping. A large steamer and 3 tugs conditionally engaged. The Cabinet meeting over, the President wrote at the bottom of this preliminary requisition the following order to the Secretary of War. "Sir, I desire that an expedition to move by sea be got ready to sail as early as the 6th of April next, the whole according to memorandum attached, and that you cooperate with the Secretary of the Navy for that object." This order and its duplicate to the Secretary of the Navy, duly signed and transmitted to the 2 departments, Captain Fox hurried to New York to superintend the details of preparation in person. It will be observed that the President's order is simply to prepare the expedition, which expedition, in his own language, was intended to be ultimately used or not, according to circumstances. But he was, by this time, convinced that the necessity would arise. Nothing had yet been heard from the order to reinforce Fort Pickens, sent 2 weeks previously. On the contrary, there were rumors through the Southern newspapers that the Brooklyn, containing the troops, had left her anchorage off Pensacola and gone to Key West. As a matter of fact, she had first transferred her troops to the Sabine, but this was not and could not be known, and the necessary inference was that the Brooklyn had carried them away with her. The direction to land them would therefore unavoidably fail, and the fort remain liable to be carried by an assault, and both Sumter and Pickens be thus left within the grasp of the secessionists. Such was the contingency which had decided the President to prepare the Sumter expedition. The logic of daily events had by this time also wrought a change in the mind of Seward. In his written opinion of March 15th, he had declared, "I would not provoke war in any way now." But on the 29th, apparently alarmed, like the rest, at the advice of General Scott to make further concession to the rebels, he wrote, "I would at once and at every cost prepare for a war at Pensacola and Texas." That very afternoon, as he had suggested in this same paper, he brought Captain Montgomery C. Meigs, the engineer officer in charge of the work on the new wings of the Capitol building, to the President. One reason for selecting him, in addition to his special training and acknowledged merit, was that he had in January personally accompanied the reinforcements then sent to Key West and Tortugas. On the way to and from the President's, Seward explained to Meigs that he wished the President to see some military man who would not talk politics, that they had Scott and Totten, but no one would think of putting either of those old men on horseback. They were in a difficulty. Scott had advised giving up both Sumter and Pickens. For his part, his policy had been to give up Sumter, but he wished to hold Pickens, making the fight there and in Texas, throwing the burden of the war, which all men of sense saw must come, upon those who by revolting had provoked it. The President talked freely with Captain Meigs, and after some inquiries about Sumter, asked him whether Fort Pickens could be held. Meigs replied, "Certainly, if the Navy would do its duty." The President then asked him whether he could go down there again and take general command of the three great fortresses, Taylor, Jefferson, and Pickens, and keep them safe. Meigs answered that he was only a captain, and could not command the majors who were there. Here Seward broke in with, "I understand how that is. Captain Meigs must be promoted." "But there is no vacancy," answered the modest captain. Mr. Seward, however, made light of all difficulties, and told the President if he wanted this thing done, to put it in Meigs' charge. When Pitt wished to conquer Canada, Seward said, he sent for a young man whom he had noticed in the Society of London, and told him to take Quebec, to ask for the necessary means, and do it, and it was done. Would the President do this now? Lincoln replied he would consider it, and let him know in a day or two. 2 days afterward, Sunday, March 31st, Meigs was about to start for church when Colonel Erasmus D. Keyes, General Scott's military secretary, called and took him to Mr. Seward, who requested them to go forthwith and in consultation with General Scott to put upon paper an estimate and project for relieving and holding Fort Pickens, and to bring it to the President before 4 o'clock that afternoon. The two officers went directly to the Engineers Bureau to inspect the necessary charts of Pensacola Harbor and drawings of the fortifications, and over these they matured their plans. The rapid lapse of the few hours allowed compelled them to report to the President before seeing General Scott. Lincoln heard them read their paper, and then directed them to submit it to the General. "Tell him," he said, "that I wish this thing done, and not to let it fail unless he can show me that I have refused him something he asked for as necessary." The officers obeyed, and on the way encountered Mr. Seward, who went with them. "General Scott," said he, on entering the old sailor's presence, "you have formally reported to the President your advice to evacuate Fort Pickens. Notwithstanding this, I now come to bring you his order, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, to reinforce and hold it to the last extremity." The old general had his political crotchets, but he was a soldier and a disciplinarian. "Sir," replied he, drawing himself up to his full height, "the great Frederick used to say, 'When the king commands, all things are possible.' It shall be done." Meigs and Keyes submitted their plan, which he approved in the main, adding a few details that they had in their haste overlooked. The project was further discussed and definitely adopted. Fort Pickens stands on the western extremity of Santa Rosa Island, and serves, in connection with its twin Fort McRae on the mainland opposite, to guard the entrance to Pensacola Harbor. But in this case the two forts, intended to render assistance to each other, were held by opposing forces, bent not upon protecting, but upon destroying each other, and restrained only by the existence of the Sumter and Pickens truce, described in a previous chapter. So far as a mere cannonade might go, Pickens was perhaps as strong as McRae, but Lieutenant Slemmer and Pickens had only a handful of Union men, 46 soldiers and 30 ordinary seamen all told, while some thousands of rebels were either encamped near or within reach of the secession general Braxton Bragg, himself a trained and skillful soldier. The chief danger was that Bragg might organize a large body of men and, by means of boats, crossing the bay at night or in a fog, carry Fort Pickens by a sudden assault before the reinforcements in the Union fleet could be landed, as they were, by the terms of the truce, authorized to do in such an emergency. The substance of Meage's plan was that, while a transport vessel bearing troops and stores landed them at Fort Pickens, outside the harbor a ship of war, arriving simultaneously, should boldly steam past the hostile batteries of Fort McRae, enter the harbor, and take up such a position within as to be able to prevent any crossing or landing by the rebels. The ship destined to run the batteries would necessarily encounter considerable peril, not only from the guns of McRae, but also from those of Fort Barrancas and supposed batteries at the Navy Yard, all, like McRae, on the mainland and forming part of the harbor defenses. For such cooperation, Meigs needed a young, talented, and daring naval officer, and accordingly he made choice of Lieutenant David D. Porter, a companion and intimate friend who, as he believed, combined the requisite qualities. One important characteristic of this Pickens expedition was to be its secrecy. Seward, in his argument on Sumter, had much insisted that preparation for reinforcement would unavoidably come to the knowledge of the rebels, and enable them to find means to oppose it. This argument applied with even greater force to Fort Pickens. The rebels controlled both the post and the telegraph throughout the South, and it was thought that upon the first notice of hostile design, Bragg would assault and overwhelm the fort. Besides, the orders transmitted through regular channels 2 weeks before had apparently failed. But now that the ships to supply Sumter were being got ready, it was doubtless thought that under this guise the Pickens relief could be prepared without suspicion. On Monday, April 1st, 1861, Captain Meigs, Colonel Keyes, and Lieutenant Porter were busy, under the occasional advice of Seward and General Scott, in perfecting the details of their plans and in drawing up the formal orders required. These were in due time signed by the President himself, it being part of the plan that no one but the officers named, not even the secretaries of War or Navy, should have knowledge of them. This was an error which only the anomalous condition and extreme peril of the government would have drawn Lincoln into, and it was never repeated. He doubtless supposed they were entirely consistent with the Sumter plans, especially as General Scott's written request for his signature accompanied the papers, the general being perfectly cognizant of both expeditions. The immediate departure of a war steamer with instructions to enter Pensacola harbor and use all measures in its power to prevent any attack from the mainland upon Fort Pickens is of prime importance. If the President, as Commander-in-Chief, will issue the order of which I enclose a draft, an important step toward the security of Fort Pickens will be taken. But although useful to secrecy, this course was bound to produce confusion and bad discipline, and such was its immediate result. That afternoon, the commandant of the Brooklyn Navy Yard received 2 telegrams in very similar language, directing him to fit out the Powhatan to go to sea at the earliest possible moment. One was signed by the Secretary of the Navy, the other by the President, the former intending the ship to go to Sumter, the latter to Pickens, and neither being aware of the other's action. Neither had reason to anticipate any such conflict of orders. The Powhatan was not included in Fox's original requisition, and Meigs did not even know that the Sumter expedition was being prepared. On the same afternoon, several additional orders, made out under Seward's supervision, were brought to Lincoln. Supposing they all related to this enterprise, he signed them without reading, but it soon turned out that 2 of them related to a matter altogether different. These orders changed the duty of several naval officers. Captain Garrett J. Pendergrast was to be sent to Vera Cruz on account of important complications in our foreign relations, and Captain Silas H. Stringham was to go to Pensacola. When these last-mentioned orders reached the hands of the Secretary of Navy, to whom they were addressed and immediately transmitted, that official was not only greatly mystified, but very seriously troubled in mind. He hastened to the President, whom he found alone in the executive office, writing. "What have I done wrong?" Lincoln inquired playfully as he raised his head, and with his ever accurate intuition read trouble in the countenance of his secretary. Mr. Wells presented the anomalous papers and asked what they meant. He had heard of no foreign complications, and he preferred Stringham in his present duty. Mr. Wells says, "The President expressed as much surprise as I felt that he had signed and sent me such a document. He said Mr. Seward, with 2 or 3 young men, had been there through the day on a matter which Mr. Seward had much at heart, that he had yielded to the project of Mr. Seward, but as it involved considerable detail, and he had his hands full and more too, he had left Mr. Seward to prepare the necessary papers. These papers he had signed, some of them without reading, trusting entirely to Mr. Seward, for he could not undertake to read all papers presented to him. And if he could not trust the Secretary of State, whom could he rely upon in a public matter that concerned us all? He seemed disinclined to disclose or dwell on the project, but assured me he never would have signed the paper had he been aware of its contents, much of which had no connection with Mr. Seward's scheme. The President reiterated that they were not his instructions, and wished me distinctly to understand they were not, though his name was appended to them, said the paper was an improper one, that he wished me to give it no more consideration than I thought proper, treat it as cancelled, as if it had never been written." Mr. Wells acted upon this verbal assurance, and was highly gratified that the President thus corrected what he felt to be an encroachment upon the duties and powers of the Navy Department. Nevertheless, it is apparent that he had his doubts whether Lincoln had fully and unreservedly given him his confidence in this affair. In these surmises he was correct. A circumstance had occurred between the President and Seward which the former could not communicate, and, so far as is known, never did communicate to any person but his private secretary, and of which the President's private papers have preserved the interesting record. In order to understand it rightly, a brief glance at contemporary affairs is needful. It will hardly be possible for the readers of history in our day to comprehend the state of public sentiment in the United States during the month of March 1861. The desire for peace, the hope of compromise, the persistent disbelief in the extreme purposes of the South, and strangest of all, a certain national lethargy, utterly impossible to account for, all seem to mark a decadence in patriotic feeling. The phenomenon is attested not only in the records of many public men willing to abandon constitutional landmarks and to sacrifice elementary rights of mankind, but also shown in the words and example of military officers in their consenting to shut their eyes to the truths and principles of their own profession, that it is the right of the government to repel menaces as well as blows, and that building batteries is as effective an aggressive war as firing cannonballs. This perversion of public opinion, in fact, extended back to the meeting of Congress in December. Under the spell of such a political nightmare, the Revolution had been half accomplished. The Union flag had been fired upon, the federal laws defied, the secession government organized and inaugurated. The work of the conspirators was done, but the popular movement had not yet fully ratified it. The difficult problem was presented to the Lincoln administration, not alone whether it should endeavor to knock down the revolutionary edifice half built, but also whether such an effort might not excite the whole Southern people to rise en masse to complete it. From our point of view, the answer is easy, but it was not of so ready solution in March 1861. Lincoln, in his hesitation to provision Sumter at all hazards, was not executing his own inclinations, but merely submitting to what, for the time, seemed the military and, more than all, the political necessities of the hour. The Buchanan administration had first refused and then postponed succor to the fort. Congress had neglected to provide measures and means for coercion. The conservative sentiment of the country protested loudly against everything but concession. His own cabinet was divided in council. The times were out of joint. Public opinion was awry. Treason was applauded and patriotism rebuked. Laws were held to be offenses and officials branded as malefactors. In Lincoln's own forcible simile, sinners were calling the righteous to repentance. It must be remembered, too, that during the month of March 1861, Lincoln did not know the men who composed his cabinet. Neither, on the other hand, did they know him. He recognized them as governors, senators, and statesmen, while they yet looked upon him as a simple frontier lawyer at most, and a rival to whom chance had transferred the honor they felt to be due to themselves. The recognition and establishment of intellectual rank is difficult and slow. Perhaps the first real question of the Lincoln cabinet was, who's the greatest man? It is pretty safe to assert that no one, not even he himself, believed it was Abraham Lincoln. Bearing this in mind, we shall be better able to understand and explain acts done and acts omitted during that memorable month. In this state of affairs, the policy of the new administration was necessarily passive, expectant, cautious, and tentative. Other causes contributed to its embarrassments. The change from a long Democratic to a Republican regime involved a sweeping change of functionaries. The impending revolution made both sides suspicious and vindictive. The new appointees could not, as in ordinary times, lean upon the experience and routine knowledge of the old. The new party was not yet homogeneous. A certain friction mutually irritated Republicans of Whig, of Democratic, or of Free Soil antecedents against each other. Douglas was artfully leading a Senate debate to foster and strengthen the anti-war feeling of the North. The cabinet had not become a working unit. Each secretary was beset by a horde of applicants, by over-officious friends, by pressing and most contradictory advice. Seward naturally took a leading part in the new cabinet. This was largely warranted by his prominence as a party manager, his experience in the New York governorship and in the United States Senate, the quieting and meditating attitude he had maintained during the winter, the influence he was supposed to wield over the less violent Southerners, the information he had gained from the Buchanan cabinet, his intimacy with General Scott, his acknowledged ability and talent, his optimism, which always breathed hope and imparted confidence. During the whole of March, he had been busy with various measures of administration. He had advised appointments, written diplomatic notes and circulars, carried on a running negotiation with the rebel commissioners, sought to establish relations with the Virginia Convention, sent Lander to Texas to kindle a backfire against secession, elaborated his policy of evacuating Sumter, proposed a change of party name and organization, and set on foot a secret expedition to Fort Pickens. All this activity, however, did not appear to satisfy his desires and ambition. His philosophic vision took a yet wider range. He was eager to enlarge the field of his diplomacy beyond the boundaries of the Republic. Regarding mere partisanship as a secondary motive, he was ready to grapple with international politics. He would heal a provincial quarrel in the zeal and fervor of a continental crusade. He would smother a domestic insurrection in the blazing glory of a war, which must logically be a war of conquest. He would supplant the slavery question by the Monroe Doctrine. And who shall say that these imperial dreams did not contemplate the possibility of changing a threatened dismemberment of the Union into the triumphant annexation of Canada, Mexico, and the West Indies? On this same first day of April, while Meigs and Porter were busy with plans and orders about Fort Pickens, Seward submitted to Lincoln the following extraordinary state paper, unlike anything to be found in the political history of the United States. Some thoughts for the President's consideration, April 1st, 1861. First, we are at the end of a month's administration and yet without a policy, either domestic or foreign. Second, this, however, is not culpable, and it has even been unavoidable. The presence of the Senate, with the need to meet applications for patronage, have prevented attention to other and more grave matters. Third, but further delay to adopt and prosecute our policies for both domestic and foreign affairs would not only bring scandal upon the administration, but danger upon the country. Fourth, to do this, we must dismiss the applicants for office. But how? I suggest that we make the local appointments forthwith, leaving foreign or general ones for ulterior and occasional action. Fifth, the policy at home. I am aware that my views are singular and perhaps not sufficiently explained. My system is built upon this idea as a ruling one, namely that we must change the question before the public from one upon slavery or about slavery for a question upon union or disunion. In other words, from what would be regarded as a party question to one of patriotism or union. The occupation or evacuation of Fort Sumter, although not in fact a slavery or a party question, is so regarded. Witness the temper manifested by the Republicans in the free states, and even by the Union men in the South. I would therefore terminate it as a safe means for changing the issue. I deem it fortunate that the last administration created the necessity. For the rest, I would simultaneously defend and reinforce all the forts in the Gulf, and have the Navy recalled from foreign stations to be prepared for a blockade. Put the island of Key West under martial law. This will raise distinctly the question of union or disunion. I would maintain every fort in possession in the South. For foreign nations, I would demand explanations from Spain and France, categorically at once. I would seek explanations from Great Britain and Russia, and send agents into Canada, Mexico, and Central America to rouse a vigorous continental spirit of independence on this continent against European intervention. And if satisfactory explanations are not received from Spain and France, would convene Congress and declare war against them. But whatever policy we adopt, there must be an energetic prosecution of it. For this purpose, it must be somebody's business to pursue and direct it incessantly. Either the President must do it himself and be all the while active in it, or devolve it on some member of his cabinet. Once adopted, debates on it must end, and all agree and abide. It is not in my especial province, but I neither seek to evade nor assume responsibility. It is a little difficult to imagine what must have been the feelings of a president, and particularly of a frank, loyal, and generous nature like that of Lincoln, on receiving from his principal counselor, an anticipated mainstay of his administration, such a series of proposals. That he should delegate his presidential functions and authority, that he should turn his back upon the party which elected him, that he should ignore the political battle which had been fought, and the victory for moral government which had been won, that he should by an arbitrary act plunge the nation into foreign war, that he should ask his rival to rule in his stead. All this might be romantic statesmanship, but to the cool, logical mind of the president, it must have brought thoughts excited by no other event of his most eventful life. What was to be said in answer? The tender of a grave issue like this presupposed grave purposes and determinations. Should he, by a fitting rebuke, break up his scarcely formed cabinet, and alienate the most powerful leader after himself, who might perhaps carry with him the organized support of all the northern states, which had voted for this rival at Chicago? The president sent his reply the same day. He armed himself with his irresistible logic, his faultless tact, his limitless patience, his kindest but most imperturbable firmness. Only the hand of iron and the glove of velvet could have written the following answer. Executive Mansion, April 1st, 1861. Honorable W. H. Seward, my dear sir, since parting with you, I have been considering your paper dated this day, and entitled Some Thoughts for the President's Consideration. The first proposition in it is, first, we are at the end of a month's administration, and yet without a policy, either domestic or foreign. At the beginning of that month, in the inaugural, I said, the power confided to me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government, and to collect the duties and imposts. This had your distinct approval at the time, and taken in connection with the order I immediately gave General Scott, directing him to employ every means in his power to strengthen and hold the forts, comprises the exact domestic policy you now urge, with the single exception that it does not propose to abandon Fort Sumter. Again, I do not perceive how the reinforcement of Fort Sumter would be done on a slavery or party issue, while that of Fort Pickens would be on a more national and patriotic one. The news received yesterday in regard to Santo Domingo certainly brings a new item within the range of our foreign policy. But up to that time we have been preparing circulars and instructions to ministers and the like, all in perfect harmony, without even suggestion that we had no foreign policy. Upon your closing propositions, that, whatever policy we adopt, there must be an energetic prosecution of it. For this purpose it must be somebody's business to pursue and direct it incessantly. Either the president must do it himself and be all the while active in it, or devolve it on some member of his cabinet. Once adopted, debates on it must end, and all agree and abide. I remark that if this must be done, I must do it. When a general line of policy is adopted, I apprehend there is no danger of its being changed without good reason or continuing to be a subject of unnecessary debate. Still, upon points arising in its progress, I wish, and suppose I am entitled to have, the advice of all the cabinet. Your obedient servant, A. Lincoln. In this reply, not a word is omitted which was necessary, and not a hint or allusion is contained that could be dispensed with. The answer was conclusive and ended the argument. So far as is known, the affair never reached the knowledge of any other member of the cabinet, or even the most intimate of the president's friends. Nor was it probably ever again alluded to by either Lincoln or Seward. Doubtless it needed only the president's note to show the Secretary of State how serious a fault he had committed, for all his tireless industry and undivided influence continued to be given for 4 long years to his chief, not only without reserve, but with a sincere and devoted personal attachment. Lincoln, on his own part, easily dismissed the incident from his thought with that grand and characteristic charity which sought only to cherish the virtues of men, which readily recognized the strength and acknowledged the services of his secretary, to whom he unselfishly gave, to his own last days, his generous and unwavering trust. End of chapter 26. Recording by Jill Ingle. End of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 3, by John Hay and John George Nicolay.